Thank you very much, Victor, for that very generous introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for coming. And I sent around a handout, and I don't think I have enough, so maybe when I draw your attention to some things on the handout, you can look on with one another. Well, I've been doing, just as everyone, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this this crisis which we're in, and I want to present some initial reflections, open-ended reflections of my own on how we can understand this crisis. And I think that the financial collapse is part of a more general crisis of the global system, of the global capitalist system. And I've emphasized that there are four dimensions to this crisis of global capitalism. And one is a crisis of global social polarization, of social reproduction worldwide. A second dimension, and one which I'm going to really focus on today, is a crisis of overaccumulation, and I'll explain that. A third is a crisis of legitimacy of political authority or political domination worldwide, really a crisis of hegemony. And the fourth dimension to this more overall crisis, of which the financial meltdown is just a part, I would suggest, is a crisis of sustainability of the global economy, the global capitalist system. So clearly, how we understand this crisis, more than an academic question, is a burning political question. And I want to suggest that a global capitalism perspective, the perspective that I've been developing in recent years, offers a powerful explanatory framework for making sense of this crisis that we're in. And I would suggest then that following Marx, we want to understand the crisis through the internal dynamics of the capitalist system, but also following a global capitalism perspective, we want to look for how capitalism has qualitatively evolved in recent decades. And that's very important because this is not going to be a repeat of the 1930s crisis or the 1970s crisis, specifically because world capitalism is fundamentally different in the early 21st century than it was in the 20th century, and we need to understand those differences if we want to get a grip on the crisis that we're facing right now. So those of you who know my work know that I've emphasized globalization as a new epoch in the ongoing evolution of the world capitalist system, a new epoch which is characterized certainly by three novel developments. And one of them is the rise of truly transnational capital and the rise of a globally integrated production and financial system. A second novel dimension of 21st century capitalism is the rise of what I refer to as a transnational capitalist class as the manifest agent now of worldwide accumulation and the global economy. And it's the transnational capitalist class, allied strata, and transnationally oriented elites that vied for and that were able to take state power in most countries around the world in the 1980s and 1990s, utilize that state power to implement capitalist neoliberalism and capitalist globalization, and did so operating through national states and through expanding transnational networks of institutions and organizations, which I've also referred to as an emergent transnational state apparatus. So what we want to do here is focus on the social origins of globalization, of these qualitative changes in the world capitalist system, and the social origins, therefore, of this crisis that we're facing right now. And I suggest that we want to see globalization as capital's response to previous episodes of crisis. Specifically, how did capital respond, and how did this system change with the crisis of the 1970s? That was the last big crisis of the 1970s, and prior to that was the 1930s. The 1970s was really a crisis in the breakdown of what we can alternatively call Fordist Keynesian capitalism, redistributive capitalism, New Deal capitalism, social democratic capitalism, and so forth. And I'm suggesting that in the wake of the 1970s crisis, capital responds by going global. And going global, or launching globalization, is a strategy of emergent transnational capital to reconstitute its class and its social power by breaking free of nation-state constraints to accumulation. Those constraints that had been imposed over a long period, historical period of struggle, of social and class struggle all around the world from the 1890s right into the 1960s and early 1970s. So capital goes global to break free of the so-called class compromise with nationally contained popular and working classes. And so with this launching of globalization, we see the launching of the neoliberal counter-revolution. And through this neoliberal counter-revolution, this unleashes transnational capital from the constraints of the nation state to the constraints of the model of accumulation worldwide in the 20th century. And this gives globally mobile transnational capital enhanced structural powers, enhanced class and social powers against populous sectors, against majorities everywhere. And in particular, what I want to get at here is that this launching of globalization and all of the neoliberal changes involved with globalization opens up vast new opportunities for accumulation in the 1980s and in the 1990s, for profit-making and accumulation worldwide. Among other aspects, which I'm sure many of us in the room are familiar with, is trade liberalization, which allows for a new wave of foreign direct investment and the spread of transnational corporate activity to new zones and new areas around the world. Deregulation, and of course when we talk about deregulation, we're also talking about the deregulation of the financial system, which in turn has brought us to the collapse now, starting in 2007. Of the global financial system. We're talking about privatizations, and in privatizations led to this incredible investment bonanza by turning over public sectors, public industry, public resources, public health and educational systems. Anything that was in the public spheres was privatized in the last few decades, and that led to a massive investment bonanza for emergent transnational capital. We can also talk about intellectual property rights, which allowed for the commodification of culture and of knowledge in many new ways, and that opened up also vast new investment opportunities in the 1980s and 1990s. And of course, we can't forget about the collapse of the former Soviet bloc and the Third World Revolutionary States, and so that opened up vast new markets and investment outlets for emergent globalizing capital in the last few decades. And then we also want a little more analytically in looking at these different dimensions in which capital is liberated from the nation state and launches this vast new round of accumulation in the late 20th, early 21st century. We can't forget also that through computer and information technology and technological changes associated with the late 20th century, transnational capital is able to shed labor worldwide and to create an enormous surplus of labor. In fact, the 1996 report of the International Labor Organization said that 1/3 of the economically active population worldwide had become unemployed or underemployed. And so we want to see the massive shedding of labor and the rise of the structurally marginalized surplus population, which is 1/3 of humanity, together with incredible increases in productivity, which is registered in the late 20th century. So all of this places, and the mobility of capital itself, incredible downward pressures on the wages and on social wages worldwide, and involves, as we all know, a massive transfer of income from working and popular classes to more affluent strata and to transnational capital itself. And so you have this tremendous global social polarization, class polarization, rising inequalities. We've never seen such incredible inequalities as starting in the late 20th century. But to the analytical point here is that this transfer of income to new high consumption sectors also fuels a new market sector, which is part of the boom in capital accumulation of the 1980s and 1990s, this new high consumption sectors worldwide, not just talking about the first world, but new high consumption sectors in India, in China, in Latin America, and so forth. So in sum, we can say that through globalization in the latter part of the 20th century, there's a major, extensive, and intensive expansion of world capitalism, a new round of primitive accumulation, and frenzied worldwide accumulation takes place. So from the 1980s and on. And what happens is, by the time you get to the late 1990s and the turn of the century, the limits to this expansion, the limits to this frenzied accumulation worldwide unleashed by globalization now starts becoming clear at the turn of the century. And why? Well, there's many explanations. Privatizations dry up. There's nothing more left to privatize. There's no new regions now to bring into the system. There's no new countries to be conquered, the former Soviet bloc countries, the former third world countries. Pockets within countries such as Chiapas, such as Amazon, the Amazon region have already now been more thoroughly brought in. There's no new regions to conquer in terms of extensive expansion. Global markets start to become saturated, and overcapacity now becomes very clear as you get into the latter part of the 1990s, with factories worldwide operating now 60 to 70% of capacity. And of course, there's again the more analytical point that one of the cutting edges of accumulation in the late 20th century was computer and information technology, which involved a whole changeover in the global productive apparatus. For any and every level, from you move to computerized production to computerized information systems and so forth. And so the cutting edge of accumulation in the 80s and 90s really, or one of the cutting edges, was computer information technology, Microsoft and the dot-com and so forth. But we can say that that involves a changeover or a turnover in fixed capital. Everything becomes computerized, becomes telecommunicized. And that can't continue. So it starts running into major problems in the late 1990s also. And here's actually a piece of data that in the investment in high technology barely grew since the turn of the century. From an incredible growth in the 80s and 90s, it barely grows from the turn of the century and is down 50% in 2006, 2007 from the previous highs of the last 2 decades of the 20th century. So to summarize all of this, it's clear that by the time we get to the turn of the century, we're headed towards a structural crisis. Okay? And remember, I started this presentation saying that this financial meltdown that we're all familiar with is part of a much bigger crisis of global capitalism. So what's going on here in this structural crisis is the generation of ever more massive surpluses made possible and unleashed by globalization. At the same time that there's diminishing opportunities to unload this surplus and to continue to accumulate capital after the boom in the 1980s and the 1990s. It's increasingly difficult for this incredible accumulation of capital to be profitably absorbed and to continue. So the global economy is expanding dramatically and the global market is contracting, and opportunities for profitable investment is contracting. And so that's a fundamental contradiction. And some of you will recognize that that's a contradiction which is inherent to capitalism itself. It's always been an intrinsic contradiction to capitalism, and capitalism has to constantly find ways to overcome that contradiction, whether it's new rounds of imperialism and its colonialism, where it's new technological and scientific revolutions or whatever, or whether it's redistribution downward through the New Deal. There always needs to be some tendency which counters this permanent problem of, or this contradiction in capitalism. So that's why out of that 4 dimensions of the crisis that I mentioned, I want to now focus really on this dimension of overaccumulation, because for me what we are fundamentally seeing is that the financial meltdown is reflecting a massive crisis of overaccumulation. That's the underlying structural dimension. So let me step back now and say we can draw here on crisis theory and critical political economy and Marxist political economy to get some insight, and in which overaccumulation is seen as following periods of hyperaccumulation. When there's a tremendous amount of accumulation, we see that it historically leads to periods of overaccumulation in which there's now problems in absorbing surpluses, in sustaining profitable accumulations. Investors suddenly find that they don't have any outlet for all of this accumulated wealth, for all of this accumulated profit, for all of this accumulated surplus. And here I would agree with Harvey, David Harvey's analysis of crisis. He has written a lot on crisis, and his argument, and one which I share, is that overaccumulation is the underlying contradiction here. He's not talking about the 2008 crisis, but more generally the dynamics of capitalism. And that overaccumulation is manifested in different crises and different historical moments in different ways. So one way, and one way that it's manifest that a lot of people have spoken about, is the so-called falling rate of profit and the profit squeeze theory. It's a theory that says that profits are diminishing. And clearly in the 1970s, which was the last major crisis and which led to globalization, in fact, there was declining profit rates, and that has been documented. I suggest that currently we are not seeing that, and if you look at page 2 of the handout, you can see, in fact, that there's certainly no profit squeeze right now. There's plenty of disposable capital. The fact that the global economy is in recession and investors are cutting off, laying off people and so forth, is not because there's not enough profits. On the contrary, there's way too much profits. So you can see from handout 2 there. Another major dimension of crisis theory is that overaccumulation is manifest in inflation. We're currently seeing deflation, actually, and in stagflation. We saw both of those in the 1970s. I'll come back and discuss that, but we are seeing some inflation of values, but that's really not how the overaccumulation crisis is manifest right now. The third dimension that people emphasize as a manifestation of the overaccumulation crisis is what we call overproduction and underconsumption. And I suggest that that really is what we're seeing in a major way right now. I mentioned already that by the 1990s, factories worldwide were operating at 60 to 70% of the capacity. And if you just follow the headlines, I've already seen 3 different newspapers with 3 different pictures of massive car lots. One was in Brazil, one was right here in California, and one was in, I think, South Korea, where they can't even unload like thousands of cars filling up lots that they can't market anywhere. So clearly, the way that this overaccumulation crisis is currently manifesting itself is in overproduction, underconsumption, tied in with global social polarization that I had mentioned. But in sum, however we look at the different manifestations of overaccumulation, what's clear is that this has always been a permanent challenge of capitalism, how to profitably unload to the surplus, how to absorb surpluses that the capitalist system itself produces. And so this overaccumulation crisis has been building up. It hits a high in 2007 with the collapse of the subprime mortgage market here in California, which I'll come back to momentarily, but it had been building up throughout the 1990s, really. And so you can say that the really first reflection of an overaccumulation crisis was the Mexico Peso meltdown of 1995, you'll remember. And then there was the giant bailout, and then there was the tequila effect that affected some other countries in 1995. Overnight, the Mexican middle class became impoverished. Then we had the 1997 to 1998 Asian financial meltdown, and then that spread also to the Brazilian to Brazil and to Turkey and to Russia, and those were also manifestations of this problem. Chronic problems now in overaccumulation as we get towards the 21st century. Then, of course, there was the global recession itself of 2000, 2001, and the explosion in Argentina. Argentina is very symbolic because that's the turning point. The rebellion, the meltdown in Argentina, and then the rebellion in 2001 against neoliberalism and global capitalism is really the turning point of this ongoing and building up accumulation crisis. So it's in 2001, and what was really a global recession, that the transnational elite sounds the alarm bells. And famously, George Soros, who's a global financier, a multi-billionaire, and not only is he a global financier speculating with money worldwide and investing worldwide and so forth, but he's also considered a leading organic intellectual of the transnational elite, of the transnational capitalist class, one that does thinking for them and makes a lot of public statements. So he famously said in 2001, we need to think about this crisis now seriously. We're at the verge of a major crisis. We need to save capitalism from itself, and that's his own quote. So by the turn of the century, with this crisis building up and manifesting itself in the system, 2 major mechanisms for the unloading of the surplus, for sustaining accumulation, now take over. And what are these 2 mechanisms? One is financial speculation, and the other is militarized accumulation. So let's look at each of these. In terms of financial speculation, clearly this has been a finance-led process of globalization. Transnational finance capital is the most mobile aspect of capital, and there's been these tremendous innovations in the last few decades which have allowed transnational finance capital this complete mobility and to really become the dominant fraction, hegemonic fraction of capital worldwide. First of all is computer and information technology, means that now capital is not restricted by any physical barriers. It operates in cyberspace with no friction whatsoever of borders. But also there's been the creation of what we call derivatives, these endless instruments in which money is now turned into a commodity which can be traded cybernetically in a frenzied fashion. So you have mortgage-backed securities. I'll come back to that momentarily because, of course, that's where things start manifesting themselves here in Southern California. You have swaps, futures markets, hedge funds, pyramiding assets, and so forth. All of these incredible new ways of manipulating and accumulating money through money, or turning money into capital for accumulation, means that any pile of money anywhere, any debt anywhere now becomes tradable and a source of accumulation itself. So you accumulate credit card debt, and someone else makes profit on top of the debt that you have. And so this means that this whole process has been financial-led, and of course we have to emphasize financial deregulation has been the most extensive aspect of deregulation in general has been financial deregulation. And all of this means that transnational finance capital has a new structural power, a new ability to move around the globe, to exercise its class and social power, and to appropriate values in new ways, irrespective of space. So we can say in summary, talking about this rise of transnational finance capital, that it now starts to act in an utterly predatory manner. Transnational finance capital now becomes utterly predatory. And so we have the rise of the global casino, the global financial casino. And we have a sequence that we can now follow in how the global financial casino plays itself out, bringing us up to this crisis of 2007, 2008, and of course now 2009. And so first, as this massive frenzied global financial speculation starts taking over, we see the real estate investment in the global cities, first in New York and London and Tokyo, but then in all of the major cities of the world. And so we see the creation of a global properties market, where financial speculators worldwide now pour their money into global real estate, and that's when, of course, values start rising incredibly in the big cities, if you're in New York or London or anywhere. I mean, later on, Sao Paulo and Jakarta and Mexico City, values go sky high, and of course that has all kinds of social and political implications for everyone. No time to go into all of that now, but that reaches its limits. Then we get in the mid-1990s, you'll remember, the stock market inflation, the S&P 500 and the other major stock markets, because that's a new financial speculation. Billions and billions and ultimately trillions of dollars in financial speculation moves into the stock market, so there's the inflation of stocks, and then it's bust. It busts several times in the 1990s. Then we get the shift into the dot-com speculation, and we get the dot-com bubble and then the dot-com bust. And so each time you get a different outlet for transnational finance capital to accumulate, and each time there's something, it reaches its limits or it busts, and then it moves on to something else. So then you get an escalation of hedge funds. And hedge funds is pure financial speculation. You're speculating with already existing, simply changing hands and betting on different assets. And you get the pyramiding of assets, particularly debt assets. And so that's handout number 3. You see this incredible increase there in hedge fund assets under investments as part of the global financial casino. Then you get the incredible rise of the U.S. consumer debt. So I'm sure all of you in this room have, but also we're talking about tens of millions of people have unbelievable debt. And let me explain the significance of the debt for global financial speculation, because you might say, well, how does my fact that I have to live in debt and I'm poorer, so I need to use credit cards more and loans to get by, what does that have to do with global financial speculation? Well, everything. But just so you're aware of the extent of this, the debt grew 5-fold of U.S. consumers from 1980 to 2001. And listen to these unbelievable data. In 1980, the U.S. consumer debt was $355 billion. It goes to $1 trillion in 1994, to $2 trillion in 2004, and to $2.6 trillion in 2008. And I think I have, that would be overhead number 4, showing a little bit of the, right there, the role of the U.S. consumer debt in absorbing surplus. Why does that absorb surplus? Because if you can't continue to accumulate, but if you use debt now to accumulate, you're temporarily offsetting the overaccumulation crisis by using credit cards to continue to consume, to keep the global economy going. The other twin dimension of this rise of the U.S. consumer debt, and in this particular instance, we want to see that the U.S. consumers and the U.S. market becomes the market of last resort. All around the world, sweatshops in China and whatever you have coming out of the global economy now is absorbed like a magnet in the U.S. through the massive increase in U.S. consumer debt to, as I was pointing out, $365 billion to $2.5 trillion. But then the flip side of this is U.S. deficits. And U.S. deficits meaning that the U.S. state is facilitating the absorption of this global surplus and offsetting the global accumulation crisis. So the US deficit goes from a surplus in 1992 to a $100 billion deficit in 1998 to a $700 billion deficit in 2004 to a $1.2 trillion deficit in 2008 that just ended. And that is page 5 of that handout, some data that you can see there. So you have those two, but the key thing I want to say here is the following, that the debt, the consumer debt, the debt that all of us owe, and tens of millions of people in the US, hundreds of millions of people owe, and that deficit in turn, because of this ironic, credible situation of the global financial casino, itself opens up massive opportunities for financial speculation. So if you owe $10,000 in credit card debt, a financial speculator can buy that debt from the person you owe it to for $11,000. And then he'll get interest back in $15,000. So debt now becomes part of the casino economy and so forth. And the deficit, the US government deficit. So finally, though, all of this is reaching its limits as we get to 2006, 2007. The second to last big outlet now for to putting off this massive collapse becomes the global commodity market speculation, and particularly food and energy market speculation in 2007. You remember the incredible increase in oil prices. That was not because there was suddenly a scarcity of oil. It wasn't supply and demand. It was because when credit card debt and these other problems started cropping up, global speculators massively moved their funds into speculating with oil and with food. So you remember food prices skyrocketing and food riots in Cairo and in Haiti and all around the world, actually, and people going to Costco here to buy bags of rice because there was going to be shortages. So that was one of the last outlets for this looming crisis of accumulation. And so in sum here, you have the global casino capitalism with ever greater expansion of what we call fictitious capital. What do I mean by fictitious capital? Well, fictitious capital is when you throw money into circulation without any base in commodities, without any base in productive activity, and without any base in real material wealth that human beings are producing and consuming and needing and so forth. And so that's, excuse me, number 6 here of these handouts show the incredible, ever greater gap between speculative economy, global finance capital speculating, and what people are calling now the real economy, real material wealth in the world. So what you see there on handout number 6, and if you can look over someone's if there wasn't enough to go around, is that for the entire year of 2000, the global trade in goods and services is about $8 trillion. And yet, for just one day, the foreign exchange financial speculation is $3 trillion. So in 2.5 days, there's more global casino capitalism with pure fictitious capital moving around the planet than real goods and services moving around the planet in an entire year. So you get this massive gap between the speculative economy worldwide and the real economy worldwide. So you can say that by the early 21st century, massive concentrations of transnational finance capital begins to destabilize the system. And so we now reach the limits of overaccumulation, the limits of the financial fix. And the big, we have to see here the consumer mortgage market really starts to take off in 2001, 2002 as the, you want to call it, the last frontier of how global finance capital is going to be able to unload itself and accumulate. So we need to see it as the latest in a string of financial fixes. This massive rise in the value of mortgages and the manipulation then that transnational finance capital can utilize to thrust the subprime mortgages on homeowners and also to massively sell homes that cannot be kept, of course, by their owners. I'll mention more of this shortly. But the key thing is that the collapse starting in July 2007 of the subprime mortgage market triggers the current crisis. It's the end of the line for this string of financial fixes. What I want to do here also is note the integrated nature of the global financial system. And so what we're talking about here, because I also have a debate here with my critics who suggest that this is U.S. against other countries and against the rest of the world, and this is a reflection of U.S. imperialism. But it's something more than that. This is really global capitalism, and so this has been global casino capitalism and speculation by transnational capital, not by just people based in the U.S., by capitalists and investors worldwide. So Russian investors put $1 trillion in the U.S. mortgage market. And so the U.S. Treasury bailout of these markets is a bailout of global capitalists, of transnational capitalists from all around the world. We need to see this. This is as a side comment here that we're not talking about U.S. capitalism generating a world crisis. We're talking about a crisis of globalized capitalism. And we really want to see the role of the U.S. state as and the U.S. as a major axis or nodal point of globalized accumulation. And the U.S. state is really the key instrument of pushing forward globalized capitalism. So I mentioned that by the turn of the century, two big mechanisms are set into motion to try and continue to absorb the surplus. One is financial speculation, and I've just spoken in brief about that. The other is militarized accumulation. And so you can see from the last of the photocopies on the handout, you can see the incredible increase in U.S. military expenditures, real increase, since 1998 in the last of those handouts. So here, what's going on is that the U.S. state turns to militarizing global accumulation. And we see a shift in the cutting edge of accumulation worldwide from computer and information technology that I already spoke about to what I refer to as a rising military, security, industrial, construction, petroleum, engineering complex. That's the new cutting edge of accumulation worldwide. And we can really see this crystal clear in the Israeli economy. In brief, what happened is the Israeli economy really takes off in the 1990s as a high-tech center. High-tech producing software and computers and all of the stuff associated with computer information technology. And then all of those firms go bust with the dot-com collapse, and then right after 9/11, Israel now becomes the biggest exporter, the biggest boom economy for security and intelligence and weaponry and so forth and so on. So that's sort of the changeover in the Israeli economy is reflecting a larger shift in the cutting edge of accumulation worldwide towards militarized security accumulation. So the war on terrorism might have its manifest function is to fight terrorism, and that's a loaded term, and I don't actually use it. But its latent function is clearly to militarize accumulation. We know now from Stiglitz's book, co-authored book, that $3 trillion is spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, but we also know that as this is the official Pentagon budget, but also unofficially, the Pentagon budget shoots up with all of these discretionary different categories to $700 to $900 billion a year. So in 2003, the only year I could come up with this data, it's hard to find and I can't calculate it myself, military spending accounted for a full 70% of the rise in the US GDP. That means 70% of any growth that took place in the US economy was accounted for by this increase in military spending. But what I want to emphasize here is that when the US spends this unfathomable amounts of money, military money, it's not just boosting the US. You can't see it in nation-state terms. It's boosting and throwing firewood on the whole global economy as the global economy is sputtering into crisis, as the fireplace of the global economy is starting to die out. And the example that, so this money flows through the open network structures, the open veins of the global economy. And the example I'd like to give is one that I used in my recent book, that Halliburton gets $200 million in a contract from the U.S. state. So the U.S. state is subsidizing accumulation of private capital, a company which you might say is U.S.-based. It's not really U.S. Halliburton itself is transnational. But because of the network and subcontract outsourcing nature of the global economy and the incredible levels of interdependence, the $200 million Halliburton takes and it now subcontracts a Saudi firm and then a Kuwaiti firm to actually do reconstruction in Iraq. And so capitalists in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait are now tied to this role of as U.S. military spender. But then Kuwait and subcontracts because they want to get supplies. They subcontract Indian producers, or Pakistani producers, or some other neighboring producers for for supplies to be brought into Iraq. And so now in India, accumulation is linked to this U.S. organized military spending. And then this Saudi Arabian firm needs to send in labor. And where do they go? They go to labor recruiters in the Philippines and send in 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 Philippine workers. And so labor recruiters and capitalists, transnational oriented capitalists in the Philippines are accumulating through labor recruiting and sending recruiters. But then those Philippine workers send remittances back. Remittances flow throughout the whole global economy, and it sustains globalized accumulation. And when those remittances go back to Philippine families, they do a lot of things. They avert a revolution in the Philippines because people can at least buy a plate of rice. But more significantly, they spend those remittances in global malls. And I came back earlier this year, 2008, from the Philippines, and everywhere there's the Walmartization and the mallization of commerce in the Philippines. So you take that remittance money, spend it in malls, and what are they buying in malls? They're buying goods that come out of the global factory, out of Chinese maquiladoras and so forth. And so in China and in the Philippines, accumulation continues, also tied in with militarized accumulation organized by the US state. And then a security firm in South Africa and Colombia recruits security agents from former apartheid soldiers and from paramilitary groups in Colombia. So you get the picture how really the US organizes this massive militarized accumulation which keeps the whole global economy running, but that reaches its limits. So this is an alternative way of understanding the role of the US state, not US reasserted US empire against the rest of the world as much as the US state plays the pivotal role in sustaining and defending and trying to keep the global capitalist system running. So all of this, though, collapses now with the trigger was the subprime collapse in July of 2007. So the question now is, how can we understand this crisis that we're in? That's the backdrop and the buildup of a larger crisis. Is it a cyclical crisis? Is it a structural crisis? Or is it a systemic crisis? And what do I mean by these three things? Well, by cyclical crisis, I mean the recurrent crises, periodic crises, recessions, and then recovery that have always marked capitalism for the last 200 years or so. And I would suggest that what we're seeing now is not a cyclical crisis. The recession of the early 1980s was a cyclical crisis. The recession of the early 1990s was a cyclical crisis. The recession of 2001 was a cyclical crisis. And just what you would expect about every 10 years. We're seeing not a cyclical crisis now, but in my prediction here, in my analysis, a structural crisis. A structural crisis means that rather than simply things pick up where they left off after you get over the recession, that you need to restructure the system in order to get it out of the crisis. So a structural crisis is a restructuring crisis. And in this sense, what we're seeing is a crisis similar to the 1970s. The restructuring crisis of the early 1970s led from Keynesian, Fordist, New Deal capitalism to globalized neoliberal capitalism. It was restructured along those lines. Or we're seeing a restructuring crisis like we had in the 1930s, where the prior to the 1930s was restructured into New Deal, Fordist, Keynesian capitalism. And so now we are seeing another structural crisis. What does a systemic crisis mean, though? A systemic crisis is when the system simply cannot be resuscitated, when you move on to a totally different system. And so whether a structural crisis, what I suggest here is that a structural crisis opens the possibility for a systemic crisis. But it does not lead in any automatic sense to a systemic crisis. Whether a structural crisis becomes a systemic crisis depends totally on the response of social and political forces, on historical contingency and conjunctural factors as history actually unfolds and as collective agency intervenes in this history. So really the key question now we want to ask in trying to understand or get some grip or predictive power on how this is going to unravel is, what are the different responses that we can now see taking place around the world to this structural crisis? What are alternative futures that we can imagine? And so I'm going to lay out 5, but I want to say that I'm not predicting any one of these 5, number 1. Number 2, and I'm not saying which I prefer, you can obviously garner that when I go through them. And secondly, they're not mutually exclusive. Not that if you have one, you don't have another. We might see many different responses, many different projects consolidating and vying for it out, or fusions of these different ones. These are simple, possible scenarios for social change as this crisis unfolds. And the first is that we're going to see we could see a global neo-Keynesianism, a global reformist project. And this would be a project to save capitalism from itself and from potential radical challenges from below. And clearly, the first signs we're seeing of this is the Obama administration putting forward a reformist neo-Keynesian type project. But we can also see that transnational elites became split in the late 20th, early 21st century, and one wing started arguing for this global neo-Keynesianism, global reformism. For instance, Joseph Stiglitz left the World Bank, left behind neoliberalism and became a reformer, Kruger, and many more. And here we see then the shift also in academia, the parallel shift from neoclassical economics to the new institutionalist economics, which argues you need state intervention and the state to set up institutions going beyond neoclassical economics. We see re-regulation, and we see a return of state intervention to regulate and resuscitate and organize capital accumulation, including stimuli and bailouts, and so forth. And possibly we will see, this is just speculation, the states that opt for this option trying to foment a shift back from financial to productive accumulation. And I would say, though, if this option is going to be viable, it has to be, any new deal must be global. Given the extent of global integration and globally integrated economy, to talk about a new deal or a neo-Keynesian project in one country is not realistic at all. And I see that we're running out of time, so I won't go into more detail on some of the points, but in discussion I can explain why I don't think we can talk about anything but a global neo-Keynesianism. But here's the thing. This may be the dominant response, a global neo-Keynesianism, global reformism, but there's no elite consensus at all. Elites worldwide are in disarray, and there's no consensus. It's way too early to predict or describe some new global capitalist model in response to this crisis. Social forces are battling it out, and they will for a long time to come. So this is one scenario. But this scenario faces a major contradiction. And it's that we have a globalizing economy within a nation-state-based political system. I've always emphasized that. And so transnational state apparatuses are incipient. They're unable to impose any regulation on the global economy. I have a quote here with this problem. Transnational elites recognize this problem. If they want to implement a global neo-Keynesianism, they have to set up transnational institutions to actually regulate and organize it. So in the recent G20 meeting, late last year, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown says, and I quote him, one of many such quotes, "We now have global financial markets, global corporations, global financial flows, but what we do not have is anything other than national and regional regulation and supervision. We need a global way of supervising our financial system. We need very large and very radical political institutional changes." So that's one scenario for the future. Another one is the resurgence of the left, of anti-capitalist forces, of socialist forces, of what some people call radical reformism or radical or leftist populism. Clearly in this, Latin America is the weakest link in the global capitalist system, is the front lines really of a more radical response to this global crisis, with Venezuela and Bolivia at the cutting edge, Venezuela having put socialism back on the agenda worldwide. But we also see everywhere a resurgence of both the organized left and of social movements. In France, in Germany, in Greece, in South Africa, split in the ANC, very complicated split, many things going on, but clearly one thing is pressure from below against neoliberalism leads to a split in the ANC. As we speak right now, the World Social Forum is having its meeting in Brazil, and 120,000 people are converging there. The upsurge in social movements, the rise of a global justice movement, all of this points to a more radical, more leftist, more popular response to the crisis of global capitalism. And it also faces all kinds of contradictions. One is that global flexibilized accumulation, informalization, has led to the severe fragmentation of popular classes worldwide. And so how do you aggregate subjectivities into a collective project of transformation? That's a big challenge that this alternative faces. Also, there's a lot of anarchist currents, and I'm not critiquing anarchy here as much as pointing out that the anarchist currents in this radical response to the crisis of global capitalism has an aversion to state power, to political forms. And so the question here is, how do you actually mount a political challenge, a political alternative, if you don't want to think about those things? And there is, of course, a lack of what Sanbon Matsu in his recent book titles postmodern prince, meaning that the social forces for a more radical challenge to the system are there, but what political vehicle, what political projects are in place for a more far-reaching transformative project. Nation states for the foreseeable future are going to be the fundamental terrain of battle among contending social forces, but certainly transnational state itself is contested terrain. And here, states are going to face spiraling fiscal and legitimacy crises. It's already happening. Let's talk about this California. And so states are going to have to face the need to generate conditions to resume transnational accumulation and are going to be unable increasingly, or have been, to respond to mass popular pressures from below. So states will face major crises. There'll be crises and collapse of political authority, and we're already facing that. So the key question here in talking about the second scenario is if mass movements from below, if they can get enough power to push elites who are seeking reformism from above more to the left. Will there be, for instance, in the US enough mass pressure from below to push Obama to the left? But this is more of a general worldwide question on how more radical forces from below interact with reformist forces from above. A third possible scenario that some have pointed out is a recoiling into national protectionism. I don't see much evidence for this, despite Russia and India and China recently enacting some measures that would appear as, classical early 21st century protectionism. I would say that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to revert the structures of an integrated global production and financial system. And in any event, if there was a return to protectionism, what would be protected would be transnational capital. What better example that if you put up tariffs right now in the US, it's transnational corporations from every corner of the world who are inside the US and would be protected by those tariffs. And similarly, the bailout of the Treasury, the $800 billion bailout that already took place, has bailed out global capitalists. So it's not even really a coherent argument to imagine a nation-state protectionist project at this point. A fourth thing that we can imagine taking place here, or a fourth response to the global crisis, and again, I'm not saying this has taken place and this is not predictive, is what I call a 21st century fascism. The confusion here when I raise this in discussion with colleagues and with critics is when I say the term fascism, they imagine it has to look like 20th century fascism. And not in the least, not at all. We don't go backwards in history. We're not going to see a new Nazism or Mussolinism. 21st century fascism would look very different. It's already looking very different where there are signs of this as a response, as a project. Certainly, there were some signs of the beginnings of an articulation of a 21st century fascist project with Bush and the neocons, with a defeated, particularly Palin wing of the McCain, the Republican platform, but also around the world. We see in Bolivia, we see in Colombia, we see in Venezuela, we see in Austria, we see in Germany, we see many parts around the world the articulation of a fascist response. And here, there's some structural components to how we see fascism. Again, how it manifests itself is then concrete historical. But structural components is when you have a fusion of capital, and in this case we're talking about transnational capital, a fusion of capital with reactionary political power. And that we've again seen signs of that. Secondly, fascism has to have a mass base. The Nazi project had a mass base in a German, so-called Aryan working class that had been displaced and downward mobility, and that was its mass base for Nazi fascism. Certainly in the US, the mass base would be a displaced white privileged sector of the working class, which is being displaced very dramatically, downward mobility, and they can respond with resistance and rebellion in a progressive sense and aligning with other popular sectors and with blacks and Latinos and so forth, or can align with a fascist mobilization from above. As also a structural feature of a fascist project is scapegoats, and clearly this was sidetracked by the electoral process, took attention away from this, but the immigrant immigrants in the U.S. was clearly the massive scapegoating community playing that role, and you cannot have a fascist project without racism and scapegoating, and we can see that all over the world. Fascist project also would involve heightened and extreme militarization, and we've seen the militarization, not just the actual raw militarization, but the militarization of culture and social relations, in extreme masculinization and millennia religious or mystifying ideologies. And if you're wondering what would be has been, at least in the last few years, that millennia reactionary ideology in the U.S., certainly Christian fundamentalism fills that bill. And if you don't believe me, just look at the film Jesus Camp, the documentary Jesus Camp. You really see a fascist ideology there. Again, this is not a consolidated project which is in power or anything. This is one of many different responses we can imagine to the global crisis. And you have to also, cannot take our eyes off of heightened coercive mechanisms, this shift which we've already seen from social welfare to social control states, to police states. In the US, the rise of a prison industrial complex and the massive increase of private security systems. So, because the challenge now to dominant groups within this crisis is how do you control the surplus population worldwide, 1/3 of humanity? And so when we look around and see things like the Congo, Gaza, a mass incarceration in the US, these are responses to the control of surplus population and potential or real rebellion. And so the need for widespread organized systems of social control gives an impulse to the fascist response to this crisis. And I was talking with Jesse Diaz, a leader of the immigrant rights movement here in the US, and we were talking about the prospects for progressive immigrant reform with Obama. And he pointed out to me very correctly that even when the political will might be there is that social control systems themselves, these fascist-oriented social control systems, now are themselves so profitable that they're a part of accumulation. And he was pointing out that the CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, has been given billions of dollars in contracts to imprison undocumented immigrants, and they are now a lobby against immigrant reform. So you also see that there's an accumulation logic to a fascist response. And this is not mutually exclusive. You can imagine a right-wing global neo-Keynesianism involving a very authoritarian structures. So a fifth, and finally, again, there's many more different possible scenarios, but the fifth one that I'll mention here, we're almost out of time, and then I'll move to concluding observations, is that we could see a global collapse. We could see a degeneration into what I refer to as global warlordism. And here, there's plenty of historic parallels of in which a civilization, when it's unable to resolve its internal contradictions, where no one social or political force is able to cohere a project and stabilize things around that project, that there's a collapse. We can talk about the Roman Empire, the Mayan civilization, Easter Island civilization, the Chinese civilization several times in its 5,000-year history. So there are plenty of historic parallels. The big difference now is that we would now be talking about the collapse of global civilization. Eric Hobsbawm, the great historian, wrote a book came out in 1996 titled The Age of Extremes. And in that he predicted, or he said, and I actually quote him, "We are not at the threshold of a revolutionary upheaval, but of a social breakdown." So it's really a vision of a global collapse. And particularly here we want to think of ecological constraints to a revival of globalized accumulation. And Sing Chu, a sociologist from University of Davis, has just written a book which is a very frightening book because it's so sociological book, it's so historically revealing, in which he says that there's a possibility, the terms he uses, is a new dark ages, particularly starting with the collapse of agriculture, central agricultural systems. So that's a fifth alternative. So some concluding observations. One, to say that we're now in crisis means that the capacity for surplus observation has now been exhausted, at least momentarily, and therefore we are in the phase of devaluation or destruction of capital surpluses. So the Wall Street Journal just reported that in 2008, $6.9 trillion worth of value was just wiped out. Of course, that means pensions and people's savings and so forth. So that's the phase of devaluation in an overaccumulation crisis. The other thing we're going to see, and we are seeing with this crisis, is a further incredible concentration and centralization of transnational capital. The 8 big banks, which were a few years ago 20 or 30 different banks, are now just 3 giant global banks. So we're going to see that. But the thing I want to conclude on here is let us recall that historically, what goes on with these crises, these major crises, is the attempt by capital, in this case transnational capital, to transfer the costs of devaluation, of destruction of capital, onto the mass of popular and working classes. And so that's what we're seeing now, and that's the front line of struggle. We're seeing middle and working classes losing their houses, for instance, in the US, to use the example of the US, and becoming homeless. We're seeing an incredible rise in unemployment. The unemployment is a mechanism of transferring to working people the devaluation of capital. We're seeing pay cuts, actual pay cuts, and days off which are not paid. We're seeing the deleterious effects of social costs of the fiscal crisis right here in California and elsewhere. So the crucial question is, what is the ability of popular classes to resist this transfer of the costs of the crisis onto their shoulders? Remember that in the 1970s, popular classes could resist that, and as a result, capital went global to undercut that resistance. And what is the ability, in turn, of dominant groups to aggravate existing hierarchies? In the US, to aggravate, for instance, hierarchies with regard to who suffers more unemployment and so forth. We know with the subprime mortgage crisis that the banks went from a process of redlining African American and Latino communities to predatory lending. We saw that crystal clear, or in Gary Dimsky's words, from racial exclusion to racial exploitation. So we need to think about all of these things. We're headed clearly towards a period of massive conflict and upheaval. It's already begun. We can look at these street protests throughout Europe. We can look at revolutions in South America. We can look at the collapse of the government in Iceland just a couple days ago. We're probably going to see the collapse of states and political vacuums worldwide. So I'll just conclude by saying that a crisis also opens up space for social forces from below and collective agency to influence the course of history in ways that are not possible at times of equilibrium and stability. So this also opens up new opportunities for progressive change, opportunities for new ideas to flourish. And the future is never predetermined. So the future is open to us and how we respond to this crisis that we find ourselves in. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, answers.
Thank you so much for a fascinating analysis. Would you clarify whether or not you think now there is in fact a profit squeeze, that the collapsing of these markets is in fact the coming home to roost of the profit squeeze? And if that's the case, then what's in your analysis isn't like foretold in section 1 of the manifesto? So what is the difference between the straight realization crisis of Marxist theory for 140 years? So I know there's something there. So if this is the profit squeeze coming home to roost, then
right.
Then what is happening that might be different?
Right. Well, to give a more authoritative answer, I have to have more time to study, to dig up data. But what I'm suggesting is that we're not seeing a profit squeeze. There's many different ways which an overaccumulation crisis expresses itself, and we're not seeing we haven't seen a decline in the disappearance of profits. That was the 1970s. The 1970s, so much of the surplus was being captured by working classes with all the social benefits and the Keynesian welfare state, that we have plenty of charts showing that profits were going down. But as I have with an overhead here, we're not seeing that at all. We're seeing that corporations are awash in profits, so it's actually a reverse thing. There's so much profits, but the thing is you can never hold on to profits. Capital, which is not in motion, is capital being devalued. It's not capital. So you get more and more and more and more hyper accumulated. It's not the problem is not a lack of profits. Problem is, where do I now invest that profit now I have $1 billion. I had 100 million, I got it to 300 million in investing it, I got to 500 million investing it. Now it's $1 billion. How do I throw it out there once more and get back 1.2 billion? How do I accumulate more? So it's an accumulation crisis that capital can't accumulate, so it doesn't lend out more credit, so it can't sell its goods, but it's not because there's a decline in profit. So what I'm suggesting, and I'm following Harvey here, I agree with him on this. I have disagreements with him on other things, on interpretations of US policy. But I agree with him that the fundamental underlying contradiction is overaccumulation, and that can be expressed at different historic moments in a profit squeeze, in other moments in the realization problem, and a glut of commodities and so forth. I'm suggesting that it's the latter right now. The global social polarization, the gap between the rich and the poor, haves and has-nots, have become so severe that really the way that an overaccumulation crisis is now reflecting itself is underconsumption, overcapacity. So that would be my suggestion on how we can
Next step,
see this.
next step, profit squeeze, right? Isn't that the next step? Like,
Well, that
sell
would
the stuff, all of a
obviously
sudden-
follow. That would
Yeah.
obviously follow, right?
So this might be an obvious point, but maybe you could elaborate on this. Like so you talked about the intensive and extensive march of capital, and I wonder sometimes. So when, the crisis that we're talking about, how much of it is extensive, and how much of it is kind of its own contradictions, that you want to accumulate so fast that your march towards accumulation outpaces your march extensively of primitive accumulation, and for those new markets to mature to get those profits back. So I'll give you an example. In Iraq, with the invasion, right, you create all these new markets and you are building the foundations, right? But global capital wants those profits to come home a lot quicker than the time is there for Iraq to then mature and give back for it. And so that outpaces itself, and so you have this contradiction, but that opportunity for that extensive capital is still there. So how much of that maybe is then what's working in Obama and kind of the neo-Keynesian stuff? And just one further evidence of this is Iraq's stock market went up during this entire, it was one of the few stock markets that's going up as all the other stock markets are going up.
As an outlet, as an
Yeah.
outlet. Yeah, well, that's very interesting, and there's certainly two things I can think of. First is that these elites that are arguing now that Keynesian mechanisms that will build up demand are clearly thinking along those lines. That you build up demand, you're closing the gap between the more rapid attempts by capital to accumulate and the actual ability to accumulate by through demand and so forth. But the other thing also is that both capitalist and, if we want to call them formally socialist systems, I don't know if I'd even call it that, the former Soviet system and so forth, problem has always been coordination. The problem has always been that you have this incredible integrated web of what's production, distribution, circulation, consumption, and endless all these different things that need to coordinate and come together. And so you have you have in capitalism, you supposedly have price mechanisms and other market mechanisms to coordinate, because what you're talking about is lack of coordination, that one thing is going faster than another thing and not hooking up with another thing. And then the socialism, you had central planning that couldn't get all of everything right with its coordination. So it's a more permanent structural problem both in capitalism and in socialism.
Okay, fine.
Okay, Krugman always talks about starve the beast, and there's been this anti-Keynesian movement in the United States embodied in the Republican Party that's been trying to break up Keynesianism for the past, I guess, 50, 60 years. And it's just been eclipsed, but it's continuing, you know. So this is part of the current debate. I'm talking about establishing a new form of Keynesianism, or global Keynesianism that's coming out of the Obama administration versus this forces, starve the beast forces of anti-Keynesianism. So there's these conscious movements that are already on the ground. So what do you think is, do you agree that there's this consciousness, because it's sort of like the logic of capital does this and that, but you know, there are these conscious forces that have been battling for years. How do you see this conflict playing out?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see the statements made by people who consider themselves neoliberal, anti-Keynesians, and commentaries in newspapers and so forth, saying we've rediscovered two thinkers. that can be useful for this crisis. And these are capitalists. And George Soros just made this comment too. We've rediscovered Marx. Honestly, Marx not to foment revolution, but to understand why capitalism is in crisis. And we've rediscovered Keynes. So clearly there's a conscious element. There's a reflection on the part of organic intellectuals among transnational capitalist class on a conscious retaking of Keynesian ideas, or if it's not even Keynesian ideas, a retaking of the notion that states need to intervene both to boost demand and to regulate frenzied and uncontrolled accumulation in order to save the system, in order to stabilize the system. But I would reiterate also that a global Keynesianism would not look like a mid-20th century Keynesianism at all. It would be very different in many different ways. On the one hand, and on the other hand, the Keynesian or the neo-Keynesian or this institutionalist response to the crisis is still in its very incipient phases, and that's why I was emphasizing that there's no. It would be a very big mistake to say there's this new emerging model of neo-Keynesianism to replace neoliberalism. In the contrary, this battle is just getting underway. This can go any different way.
I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit on this idea of warlordism or a collapse of global capitalism. And I wonder, do you see, when you talk about this, do you mean like a total collapse into something new? Or is this more along the lines of Zizek has described this nightmare capitalism, where if you look at Katrina or with the heightening water levels, if corporations could kind of take advantage of this collapse, where they could actually gain in power and people would be more desperate and more dependent, where transnational corporations could actually still maintain what they're doing in this collapse.
Right. The latter is what I mean. I don't think there's going to be. I mean, we have these films that show that there's either a nuclear holocaust or for one or another reason, and then people are just in tiny little communes locally fighting one another. That's not quite what I mean by global warlordism. The notion of warlordism comes from the Chinese Empire. The Chinese civilization is the oldest, longest running civilization, going back 4.5 thousand years. And on two different occasions, there was well, more than two, but two big occasions, there was a collapse of centralized Chinese authority, and then there were local warlords basically ran their local fiefdoms, and so there was a collapse of some ability to produce a centralized social formation. And I'm suggesting that it would be along those lines, so we get some images of that. We get one image that you pointed out, and I pointed out too, is Katrina. Those images of Katrina. Another one is this film that came out a few years ago, and the film wasn't particularly good in terms of in terms of a quality film, but the images were very chilling because they were so realistic to what would be a global warlordism. Was children of men or children to men, something like that. And, yeah, so you get the image that there's a state, there's accumulation, there's capital, there's a property class, and what you do is, and also social control is much more sophisticated in the manipulation of space and the cordoning off of surplus populations, such as we see in the Congo and such as we see in Gaza, is such that, I mean, that you get those images. There's no central. It's impossible to reproduce a stabilized global capitalist system. So you have these nightmare social control systems rather than stabilizing, marginalizing, and controlling surplus and marginalized populations. Global gated communities. The whole globe organized as gated communities.
Let's take a string of questions and then see if Bill could wrap it up with an answer to all of your questions. So we'll go here, there, back there, and finally here. Okay?
Really loved your talk. Just briefly, you ended on a note of historical openness and contingency, but the story you tell, certainly from 2000 onward, seems so overdetermined in terms of the pressure, the causes of, and the results, and the consequences of overaccumulation. What opportunity was there really counterfactually for the U.S. state to respond in a different way? And even if you'd had a Gore administration that was maybe slightly more, or slightly less militarized and slightly more sensitive to kind of class distinctions, could the state have really responded differently? And if so, would that have kind of forestalled or headed off the crisis?
Yeah, So Bill, I mean, I read it in two ways. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about in terms of your option on nationalism and rising blocks of nations and whatnot. One possibility could be China, the Chinese rulers. There's a lot of social unrest in China. The way Chinese economy is really slowing down is very, very fast. That they devalue the yuan, and obviously Geithner has already made some kind of statement that Chinese have, artificially inflating their currency, deflating currency. If it falls further, then is there a chance that it could open up a big gap there? Because the Chinese rulers certainly fear their, all the people who are being thrown out of work. And that's one kind of possibility. But the idea that I'm saying is, okay, we have the global logic working out in the transnational capital, and then there's logics of, say, space, of geography also. So I mean, the other point would be, how do you see it end up in, say, 10 years from now, when they resolve this crisis in terms of geography? Would there be a kind of shift to Asia? Are those some of the things that we can think about?
If capital accumulation finds a new outlet and job growth goes up and unemployment goes down, and there's a kind of, I guess we can say, fix, would neoliberalism ideas continue, or do you think there's like this an inevitable change to the world economic structure?
Finally.
Oh, my question is on the future of the secular state. You mentioned the new Keynesian structure, and you mentioned also Greece and Iceland collapsing, their states collapsing. But then you gave the I wanted to say that, like, let's say Bolivia, they almost collapsed with the regional divisions that they had, but then UNISOR came in, and somehow they worked it out, and they saved Bolivia in a political way. So my question is, what's the role of the secular state, and also connecting it with regional ties, like regional blocks, such as the EU or like UNISOR?
Okay, all really, was there another one?
Yeah, no.
I mean, all really good questions, and we could spend a lot of time discussing all of them. So I'll have to be brief, given that we're almost out of time. I think this is very important. What could have happened in a different way in the last 10 years? Certainly, if Gore had, who won the elections, had actually been allowed to take over the presidency. But I would suggest, obviously things would have been different. We might not have had a war in Iraq and so forth. Nonetheless, I want to suggest that the neoliberal project is not a right-wing project or a Republican project as compared to a Democratic project. On the contrary, it's a unified. Neoliberalism is fundamentally a project of transnational capital and has been defended and pushed by, in the US, both by Democrats and Republicans, and worldwide by transnationally oriented elites, both of more liberal and more conservative political persuasion. And really, in the 1990s, neoliberalism was close to forging a hegemonic bloc, a new historic bloc. And that cracked because of the crisis, because of the contradictions of neoliberal capitalism. And remember that Clinton pushed as much this deregulation and free trade agreements and the financial speculation as much as, or just as much as did the Republicans when they came in here in the US in 2001. The militarized accumulation also began under Clinton. So it might have played itself out a little bit differently. There might have been more opportunities to ameliorate the worst edges of this of how things unfolded over the last 8-9 years. But I don't think, though, that this was this crisis is a result of bad policies of right-wing Republicans rather than internal to the system, and that elites were fairly unified around the responses they were giving. At least that's my take on it. And of course, this is all interesting debate in many ways to look at it. With regard to China, I don't want to deny that there are geopolitical dimensions to the global crisis and to the global system, but I see those geopolitical dimensions very differently than many people tend to, looking through at this with lenses, 20th century lenses. And so, the big question is, to what extent have dominant groups around the world, within their individual nation states and regions, to what extent does their own interest lie in an integrated global production and financial system and global society, or to what extent do dominant groups worldwide have their own interests and the defense of their own interests in challenging or breaking away from the larger global system. So the only two countries that I've mentioned in my own work that we need to look at that have not been so thoroughly integrated to global capitalism that you can imagine a geopolitical reaction against the global system that I've mentioned is China and Russia. But even at that, the Chinese elite, increasingly, the Chinese elite, their own reproduction as a privileged trait, Chinese capitalist and Chinese state elite, is now so tied to the reproduction of global capitalism that it's very hard to imagine at this point significant political, military friction or trying to break away and set up some alternative regional system. However, that's still not consolidated. To say that China is in a tremendous flux, so that's still an open-ended question. But I don't share these views that there is a hegemonic center and the hegemonic center is shifting to Asia. And if there were time, I would also talk about lessons that recently came from Argentina, but there's not, so I'll skip that. Finally, second to finally, even if there is a stabilization of this crisis, I would say that neoliberalism is moribund. That neoliberalism was really part one of a dramatic restructuring of the world economy and a transition into a globalized phase of the world economy. Phase that went from the late 1970s, early 1980s up until this crisis or even before this crisis. And so there could be a restabilization of the globalized economy, but it would not be a reversion to the neoliberal model. That would be my view, that neoliberalism is it's dead. Neoliberalism is dead. Good riddance to it. So it's not clear what will take its place even with a stabilized global capitalism. And finally, Bolivia brings to the fore, if we had time to discuss the Bolivian case, a lot of the contradictions and dilemmas of global capitalism, but all of the different social and political forces attempting to intervene in this crisis and in global capitalism. You have in Bolivia a opposition to the indigenous popular majority that really has a classical fascist project. I mean, it's truly this fascist opposition in Bolivia. And you have also an attempt in Bolivia to have a more, of those options I was giving, a socialist or certainly a radical response to the crisis, and you have the battle between those two forces. And you also have in South America a recognition, in my view, that any alternative to global capitalism needs to be transnational, in the sense that Venezuela you can't have a construction of 21st century socialism in one country, either in Venezuela or in Bolivia. So you have it searching in Bolivia and Venezuela and South America for a transnational, regional project in defiance of the global capitalist project. But there's all of these contradictions. I'll end with this. I mean, shouldn't be surprising to say that everything is contradictory, but even when in South America they're trying to, UNASUR and so forth, and then the Bolivarian project is trying to create a regional alternative to global capitalism, that regional bloc is tied so deeply into global capitalism, so Venezuela has to continue to export its oil, and that's the financial backbone of this regional alternative. So I'm not going to say that an alternative has to be global, and so you can only have a global, single global project, but we have all of these contradictions, all of these unanswered questions. So I know I'm ending this with more questions and more confusion probably than I opened it, but that's the moments of January 2009 that we face, that we're in.
Well, thank you, Bill.